low level in the organization, we know that that can be done by an appointed authority, right, a supervisor. We want it to be done by an appointed supervisor. We expect that it would be done by a supervisor. But there's nothing inherent in that definition that would suggest that the supervisor is the only person who might do this. And this is where you get into the post-heroic world. The heroic studies of leadership always study the top guy, maybe woman. The post-heroic world is saying, maybe we could find this in other places. So the critiques of that heroic model have been many, but they boil down to two themes. One is that occupying a supervisory position doesn't magically make you a leader. And again, if you can think in your own experience of a supervisor you had who wasn't leader-like, you could see this. And then the second is that these vertical models are of questionable relevance in today's world. It's kind of a today's world kind of argument. And this could be country-specific, this today's world thing, but this is the argument that is made. And the argument's made is that in the modern organization, where we're doing more knowledge work, service work, etc., and we're also doing it in organizations where the tasks are more ambiguous and complex. And we're in environments that are dynamic, fast-changing, and complex. And so the tempo of work is becoming more complex, faster, unpredictable. And then the argument is made that tasks are migrating down the organization because the top is busy coping with the chaotic business environment. So things that the top maybe used to do are being done in lower and lower levels in the organization. And then because of cost pressures, we also have a lot more flatter organizations where supervisors are being asked to supervise way more people. And it's hard to have all that leadership done by one person. And so we need, the argument goes, we need more people at more levels to meet these challenges. I should have said as I got into this sort of where are we going to have our picnic, a lot of these aren't my arguments. These preceded me. I came into this literature saying, oh, isn't this interesting, this work of other people? So the question was, what if we relaxed the assumption that the leaders are the people in supervisory positions? What if we thought that leadership is not necessarily tied to hierarchy? Could be, but not necessarily. A state that anyone can enter into. Bob Quinn, who's on our faculty, talks about leadership as a fundamental state that supervisors enter into sometimes, and then they're not in that state sometimes, and that other people could enter into. A process rather than an entity, that it's something done over time and unfolds over time rather than you are a leader, you are not a leader. Leadership is a process. Something that can be shared on a team. Many people could do it. And then where my colleague Scott DeRue and I entered the literature is an identity that's available to anyone. So the picture could look like this. Maybe the CEO's a leader, maybe not. Maybe there's leadership being done at the other levels. And maybe we might find a real leader down in the ranks there, and that could be good for the organization. So that's the general argument. That's kind of, these were out there, and this is where we entered into the literature. And to me, it was very exciting, because it opens up a new space to ask different questions about leadership than let's study those humans in supervisory positions to death, and they have been studied to death in terms of their attributes. So how is it possible? How might we promote this in the organization and so forth? But it also opens up a whole lot of confusion. Who do we look to for leadership? Who do we look to study as leaders? You know, if we could just go out and find supervisors, that's pretty easy. We know how to do that. But how do we even identify them? And what about them should we study? And how does the formal structure with its designated leaders interact with this more informal leadership that might be going on? So it was both exciting and kind of confusing. So Scott and I then wrote a couple of papers, first a chapter and then this AMR paper, to kind of, we felt like the literature was great on this suggestion that we need to go beyond the hierarchy, and not so great on how do we sort of formalize a study of that, those processes that are beyond the hierarchy. And so we came up with a theory paper that was aimed at helping. And whenever someone tells me, oh, I'm using your theory paper, I always want to say, oh, but it's still very early. There's going to be a lot more theorizing in this area before we have it kind of nailed down. It's not a nailed down kind of theory. Yeah?
So are you suggesting that your leader at the lowest level of the organizational hierarchy, and given your definition, is actually able to set a goal and then motivate his or her supervisors for that goal as well? Are you suggesting that this is also possible?
That's one possibility. Or that person might identify very strongly with the goal that is set and get involved and motivate. Might do just the second part, just the motivating of his or her colleagues to get on with that goal.
Okay.
Yeah.
But are the goal and the collectivity, are they, in your view, defined? Or is if somebody has an idea and he tries to mobilize people around that idea, suddenly an objective emerges and there was no group, there was no task, there was no objective.
Right.
But it's like an opinion leader in the end, right? The word leader is also in the opinion leadership literature, it's also there. But that has nothing to do with hierarchy or anything. It's with an individual having an idea and then mobilizing others along that idea.
That would fit I would be very interested in that and consider that part of the processes I'm talking about. And it does have something to do with hierarchy only in the following sense. That person may be an appointed supervisor or may not. Yes. And I'm allowing for the possibility that it may not. I and others. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about this theoretical perspective, just so you understand the language, and then we're going to narrow down to look at one of the variables that might predict some of this stuff we're talking about. Okay, so Scott and I entered in, and we thought that we made a couple basic assumptions. One is that your identity matters. And identity is how you think about yourself. And it matters because there's a lot of statements in the literature and recently some data emerging that suggest that if you have an identity, say as a leader, you're going to act differently than if you don't. And there's like consistency arguments that you act consistent with your identity. So if you have an identity of the leader, you might seek out leadership development opportunities. Therefore, you would grow more in your leadership. If you didn't have an identity as a leader, you wouldn't do that. And then the second assumption we made is that in organizations, being seen as a leader is a positive thing. Now, this is an assumption because sometimes we don't like those opinion leaders. We just want them to shut up and go away. But at least in U.S. companies, there is such a strong desire for more leaders, and maybe not that we want them to lead right now, but we want to have them in a succession line to lead later when we put them in a position. So companies are spending a lot of money trying to identify the leaders, etc. So it's a positively valued identity. And then we had two questions. And what causes some people to see themselves as a leader and not others? Why do some people come to see themselves that way? And then what causes some people to be seen by others as a leader and it doesn't happen to other people? So if organizations put people in a line of succession based on, oh, he's a real leader, why does somebody get that statement made about them and other people don't? Those were the questions we were interested in. So, starting off with identity. Here's how scholars think about identity. This is just a random person's identity. And they think about it as these bubbles you have in your head. And size of bubble is, the importance of the identity to who you are. And it can be things like roles, like mom or professor, and attributes like loyal friend or creative. And then people believe that they vary in importance. That's the size of the bubble. They vary also in terms of their actual versus potential. I don't know that I've been real creative in a long time, but I hold it as a identity in my mind. I'm not actualizing it right now. And then there's also this idea that we have enduring identities and provisional identities, that we try on identities. This has been studied, for example, at times of transition, which we'll talk about in a moment. We try on identities to see if this could be me. Could I be, this way or seen that way? So our question is just, when will leader show up in that picture in someone's head? So that's about identity. So the thoughts about what shapes identity, these are huge literature, so I'm just going to just give a couple of insights. Wide agreement that identities are multiple, you've got a lot of bubbles, and mutable, they can change over time. So, and the third idea is that they are socially constructed. Okay, so the idea is it's shaped by what you observe about yourself and what others observe about you and feed back to you through their influences. Okay, that's just basic, long ago social construction. There's also this theme in the identity literature called identity work. And identity work are active strategies individuals use to shape and present their identity. So there's this idea that, a long ago idea from social construction, that we shape our identities in interaction with other people, and they're the first people to introduce the terms that identities are granted and claimed. So you want the identity of intellectual, right? And everybody sort of sniggers when you talk, and you've noticed that, and you go, oh, well, maybe I'm not as intellectual as I think I am. So that would be a way of, a claim would be making a very erudite contribution with really big words and a lot of complexity. That's your claim to being an intellectual. And then you notice people are giggling. They're not granting you that claim, right? That's kind of how this thought is thought to go.
So,
yeah.
Are you conceptualizing identity the same as self-concept?
Yeah.
It's the same.
Basically, your identities are your self-definition, how you define yourself, similar self-concept. Now, if you got into the self-concept and identity literature, there might be
there is some sort of
fine differences,
but that's fine.
For this purpose,
yeah.
It's not that important. So the identity work literature, as I said, people engage in forming, repairing, maintaining, strengthening, or revising their identities. Some of this was done on people who hold sort of damaged identities or less esteemed identities, like homeless. Someone did a study of homeless people and how they try to work on showing a different identity to people. So if you take those things together, it says we're shaped by our social environment, but we also have agency. And that was important to us. That it's not just other people tell us who we are. We have agency in trying to get the world to tell us certain things. And so here's a couple of organization examples. Carolyn Bartel and Jane Dutton did a study of temporary workers in a company and how they tried to claim the identity of member, and others either granted it or didn't grant it to them. And then I mentioned this a little bit in passing, but Hermia Barra and Roxanne Barbalescu studied people undergoing transitions in organizations. They make claims for new identities associated with that role, and those are either granted or not granted by others. And so we were wondering about this process applied to leadership. Could claiming and granting play a role in how people come to think about themselves as a leader? And so we thought it might be particularly relevant for leadership because some identities are kind of straightforward. You're a father, or you're not a father. You're male or you're not male. Though, in the U.S., even that one gets, there's probably nothing that scholars haven't argued is ambiguous. But, those are more straightforward. But leadership, given how I started with that definitional issue, it means different things to different people. And different things in different areas. The way you might act as a leader in one area, if you were to do it over here, people wouldn't even recognize it as leadership. And just who is a leader, or what constitutes leadership, is often ambiguous. And so for leadership, we thought that it's a positively valued identity, and there's higher ambiguity, and so there's higher ambiguity, greater potential for reward, so there might be more of this identity work going on. So we thought these processes might be relevant for leadership. Okay, so I'm working my way into this. So here's what we